Delegates in Copenhagen will get a look at Canada's Arctic tomorrow. A new film, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, is being shown during the summit.
The Inuit elders, with generations of wisdom, have issued a chilling warning to NASA and the entire world. They claim that the Earth has shifted, but how is that even possible? From changes in the sun's position in the sky to unpredictable weather patterns, these elders have noticed signs that something is seriously off. Could this be the reason behind the melting Arctic ice and strange animal migrations? Join us as we explore the ancient knowledge that's challenging modern science and uncover the truth behind this urgent warning. The origins of the Inuit elders. The Inuit people are the direct descendants of another group of people called the Thule people. Imagine this. The Thule, who appeared around 1000 CE, originated in the Bering Strait and western Alaska after the Thule split from the Aleut group about 4,000 years ago. They came from northeastern Siberia. In due course, they migrated to the east to the Arctic region, and from there gradually penetrated the territories of modern Canada and Greenland. Before the Thule, the Arctic region had the Dorset culture, which in Inuktitut is referred to as Tuniat. The Tuniat were the last large group of the Paleo-Eskimos that inhabited the Arctic before the arrival of the Thule people. When the Inuit refer to Tuniat in their myths, they refer to them as big folks, which are said to be taller and stronger than the Inuit themselves. However, some legends also call them dwarfs. The Inuit had some advantages over the Tuniat. They used dogs to move around and created larger tools and better technology. They arrived at Greenland around the year 1100 and began to establish themselves there and extended their region to East Greenland by the 12th century. When the Inuit people's numbers increased, and other tribes such as the Algonquian and Siouan-speaking peoples migrated to the region, the Tuniat disappeared. It is believed that by the 1400s or 1500s, the Tuniat had disappeared from the region. However, in the mid-1950s, a researcher named Henry B. Collins found evidence of ruins on Southampton Island, and the inhabitants of the place Sadlermayut were considered as the last surviving group of Tuniat. Unfortunately, the Sadlermayut people did not live past the winter of 1902-1903, in which they were completely eradicated by new diseases introduced to them by Europeans. Moving to the 21st century, scientists applied mtDNA for the purpose of understanding the relationship between the Tuniat and the Sadlermayut. Although some conclusions pointed at their relationship as related, further genetic studies in 2012 revealed no immediate connection between the Sadlermayut and the Tuniat. Despite this, the Sadlermayut, like the Aleut, benefited from geographic isolation and their ability to adopt certain Thule technologies, which helped them survive longer than other Tuniat groups. The Inuit mainly lived north of the Arctic tree line, with some exceptions in areas like Labrador. In Labrador, there are two Inuit groups, Nunatsiavut, recognized by Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, and Nunatukavut, an independent group. The southernmost Inuit community in Nunatsiavut is Rigolet, while L'Anse au Clair in Nunatukavut is the southernmost Inuit community in the world. South of the tree line, other indigenous cultures had already established themselves. These groups, like the Chukchi and Siberian Yupik in Russia, Arctic Athabascan and Gwich'in in Alaska, and Cree and Innu in Canada, often competed with the Inuit for territory. Despite these challenges, the Inuit managed to maintain their northern territories, though they didn't expand much further south. The Inuit had trade relations with these southern groups, but conflicts over boundaries were common, leading to occasional warfare, especially among Inuit groups with larger populations. For instance, the Nunamaiut, who lived near the Mackenzie River Delta, was known for engaging in warfare, while the more sparsely populated Inuit in the central Arctic did so less often. The Inuits' first European contact was with the Vikings, who had settled in Greenland centuries before. The Viking sagas mention encounters with the Skrælingr, a term likely used for all indigenous peoples they met, including the Tuniat, Inuit, and possibly the Beothuk. After around 1350, during the Little Ice Age, the climate grew colder, forcing the Inuit to abandon their whaling sites as bowhead whales disappeared from Canada and Greenland. This change significantly impacted their way of life, as they had to rely on a much poorer diet and lost access to essential materials for their tools and homes. Early contact with Europeans. The Inuit lived relatively untouched by European influence until the mid-16th century, when Basque whalers and fishermen began working along the Labrador coast. These Europeans set up whaling stations, and while the Inuit didn't interfere much with their operations, they did raid the stations during winter, taking tools and other items made of iron to use for their own needs. In 1576, the explorer Martin Frobisher, searching for the Northwest Passage, made the first well-documented contact between Europeans and Inuit. He landed in Frobisher Bay on Baffin Island, close to where Iqaluit is today. Frobisher's crew met the Inuit on Resolution Island, but when 5 of his men were left behind, they became part of Inuit mythology. According to Inuit oral tradition, the men lived among them for a few years before dying in an attempt to leave Baffin Island in a self-made boat. Frobisher later captured 3 Inuit and brought them to England, making them possibly the first Inuit ever to visit Europe. The Inuit were semi-nomadic, relying on fishing and hunting in lakes, seas, ice platforms, and tundra. While there were stories of the Inuit being hostile to early French and English explorers, recent research suggests that their relations with whaling stations along the Labrador coast were mostly based on mutual trade interests. By the late 18th century, the Moravian Church began missionary work in Labrador, supported by the British, who wanted to stop the Inuit raids on their whaling stations. The missionaries provided the Inuit with iron and other materials, leading to more peaceful relations between the two groups. However, the arrival of Europeans brought devastating changes to the Inuit way of life. The introduction of new infectious diseases, to which the Inuit had no immunity, caused mass deaths and enormous social disruptions. Despite these challenges, Inuit society in the higher latitudes remained relatively isolated during the 19th century. The Hudson's Bay Company set up trading posts, like the Great Whale River, now Wapmagustui and Kuujjuarapik, where whale products were processed and furs were traded. In the early 19th century, explorers like Commander William Edward Parry provided detailed and sympathetic accounts of Inuit life. Parry's expedition to the Northwest Passage, particularly his time spent in what is now Iqaluit, gave the world some of the first well-documented insights into Inuit culture, the early 20th century and beyond. During the early part of the 20th century, there was increased interaction between the Inuit and traders, as well as missionaries, in the areas that were more accessible. After 1904, the Northwest Mounted Police also came. Unlike other indigenous peoples in Canada, the Inuit inhabited territories that were initially of no interest to the Europeans because of the extreme climate of the Arctic. Yet, as the more temperate areas of the country filled with settlers, the Canadian government and business leaders became more involved with the fur and mineral-rich Arctic areas. By the late 1920s, there were no more Inuit who had not been contacted by traders, missionaries, or government officials. It was only in 1939 that the Supreme Court of Canada defined the Inuit as Indians and that they fell under federal legislation. This decision revealed a new approach of the Canadian government towards the Inuit people. In the course of time, the new European culture started to replace the old Inuit one, particularly due to the influences of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, who was implementing Canadian legislation in the territories inhabited by the Inuit people. Most of the Inuit, like Kikik, needed to grasp the new set of norms of this peculiar society. However, Protestant missionaries brought a moral structure far from Inuit culture, and many people converted to Christianity in the 19th and 20th centuries. The impact of World War II and the Cold War. During World War II and the Cold War, Arctic Canada suddenly became a strategically important area. Modern long-distance aircraft made these remote regions more accessible year-round, and the construction of air bases and the distant early warning line in the 1940s and 1950s brought the Inuit into more frequent contact with European society. This meant that Inuit children were introduced to public education, which often clashed with traditional Inuit values and culture. Many Inuit elders were concerned that this new Canadian education system promoted foreign values that didn't respect their traditional ways of life. The High Arctic Relocation. In the 1950s, the Canadian government planned to resettle several Inuit communities, an action that would shape their lives in the future. The government had several reasons for this relocation: to prove Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, to curb overhunting and subsequent food shortage, and to integrate the Inuit into the Canadian society, which they called solving the Eskimo problem. One of the worst forced relocations occurred in 1953 when 17 Inuit families were relocated from Port Harrison, now Inukjuak, Quebec, to the very north to Resolute and Grise Fjord. These families were dropped off in early September, just as winter was setting in. The land they were sent to was harsh and barren, with only a brief summer when temperatures rose above freezing, and long months of polar night. They were promised by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, that they could return to their home territory within 2 years if conditions were too difficult. But instead of returning home, more Inuit families were relocated to the High Arctic 2 years later. It took 30 years before they could visit Inukjuak again. Government realization and settlement. By 1953, even Canada's Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, admitted that the government had been neglectful in its administration of the vast northern territories. The government began establishing around 40 permanent administrative centers to provide education, healthcare, and economic development services. Inuit from smaller camps across the north began gathering in these new hamlets, leading to significant changes in their way of life. The availability of modern medical care increased birth rates and decreased death rates, causing the Inuit population to grow. However, this population increase made it harder for them to survive using their traditional ways of life. By the 1950s, the Canadian government actively encouraged the Inuit to settle in permanent villages and cities. In some cases, like in Nuntak and Hebron, the Inuit were forced to move against their will. In 2005, the Canadian government officially acknowledged the abuses that occurred during these forced resettlements: cultural renewal and political activism. Contrary to the expectations of anthropologists like Diamond Jennis in 1964, who thought that Inuit culture was nearly doomed, political activism of Inuit started in this period. The Canadian government provided grants to set up government-controlled, non-denominational high schools in the Northwest Territories and other Inuit regions of Quebec and Labrador. Due to its small population, the Inuit could not afford to have high schools in all the communities. Therefore, there were only a few of them. These schools housed students from all over the Arctic, and for the first time, young Inuit were living together in such institutions. It also introduced them to the civil and human rights movements that were emerging in Canada during the 1960s. This was an eye-opener to many young Inuits, hence leading to a new generation of activists demanding respect for Inuit culture and their lands. Other regional organizations emerged in the same period, such as the Committee for the Original Peoples' Entitlement, or the Inuvialuit, the Northern Quebec Inuit Association, now known as the Makivik Corporation, and the Labrador Inuit Association for the Inuit of Northern Labrador. The Southern Labrador Inuit of Nunatukavut also started political organization in the mid-1980s when they were geographically left out of the LIA. These activist movements began to alter the course of Inuit society. The first major agreement for the Quebec Inuit was signed in 1975 as the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. This settlement also involved a huge cash payout and substantial administrative control in the new territory of Nunavik, which was later followed in the other settlements. The Northern Labrador Inuit submitted their land claim in 1977, though it wasn't until 2005 that they had a signed land settlement establishing Nunatsiavut. The Southern Labrador Inuit of Nunatukavut are still in the process of establishing land claims and title rights, recognition and influence. In 1982, Canada's Constitution Act officially recognized Inuit as Aboriginal peoples in Canada. That same year, the Tungavik Federation of Nunavut, TFN, was incorporated to take over land claims negotiations on behalf of Inuit living in the eastern Northwest Territories, which would later become Nunavut. Inuit also began to gain representation in Canada's federal government. On October 30, 2008, Leona Aglukak was appointed as Minister of Health, becoming the first Inuk to hold a senior cabinet position, although not the first Inuk in the cabinet. Earlier, Jack Anawak and Nancy Karatak-Lindell served as parliamentary secretaries. Understanding Inuit identity and terminology. The term Eskimo has been used to describe Inuit and other Arctic peoples, but its usage has declined in North America in the 21st century. While it's still commonly used in the United States to describe Inuit and the Siberian and Alaskan Yupik and Inupiat peoples, the term is considered pejorative by some Canadian and Greenlandic Inuit. The word likely originates from the Inuemun Montagnais language, meaning a person who laces a snowshoe, although it's often incorrectly thought to mean eater of raw meat in Cree. In Canada and Greenland, the preferred term is Inuit, which means the people in the Eastern Canadian Inuit language, Inuktitut, and West Greenlandic, Kalaalisut. Since these are the prestige dialects in Canada and Greenland, their versions of the word have become dominant, although every Inuit dialect has its version. Their interesting beliefs. The harsh and beautiful environment where the Inuit people have lived for centuries has shaped a mythology filled with thrilling tales of adventure. Their stories are often about hunting massive creatures like whales and walruses, and the long, dark winters gave rise to legends about mysterious ghosts and fantastical beings. Some Inuit believe that the Northern Lights, or Aurora Borealis, show images of their loved ones dancing in the afterlife. But not everyone sees the lights as friendly. Some stories warn that if you whistle at them, the lights might come down and take your head. This tale is still told to kids today, keeping the old traditions alive. For many Inuit, the Northern Lights were also seen as spirits or giants, guiding hunters or helping the shaman, known as the Angakuk, in healing. The Angakuk wasn't just a healer, but also a spiritual guide, someone who could see and interact with the unseen forces that influenced everyday life. These shamans weren't leaders in the community, but their spiritual role was crucial. They weren't trained in the way we think of education today. Instead, their abilities were recognized by the community as they grew up. Inuit religion was deeply connected to their daily lives, with simple yet important rituals. They believed that every being, whether human, animal, or even inanimate object, had a soul. Because of this, hunting and daily activities had to be done with respect. If the proper rituals weren't followed, the spirits of the animals could become angry and seek revenge. Life in the Arctic was tough and unpredictable. So the Inuit lived with a constant awareness of the forces they couldn't control. A streak of bad luck could spell disaster for an entire community. To avoid this, the Inuit believed it was essential to stay in harmony with the supernatural powers that provided them with the necessities of life. But life in the Arctic is changing. The Inuit Elders' Warning. Hunter Noah Maytuk, who lives 30 miles from the Arctic Circle, can feel it. The once frozen grip of the Arctic is loosening, and the animals that the Inuit depend on are moving further north as the ice retreats. Polar bears are losing the ice floes they need to hunt, seals are struggling to find stable ice for giving birth, and animals that have never been seen so far north, like robins and hornets, are showing up in Arctic villages. The effects of global warming are hitting the Arctic first and hardest, and the Inuit, described by one of their leaders as sentries for the rest of the world, are seeing it firsthand. This past winter was the warmest yet, a part of a troubling trend that many scientists believe will soon affect the entire globe. In Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and northern Russia, the Inuit are noticing changes everywhere. In Labrador, hunter Simon Kohlmeister had a close call when the ice he was driving on with his snowmobile began to crack. "Someday we won't have any snow," he said, expressing a fear that the Inuit way of life is disappearing along with the ice. In Resolute Bay, Inuit residents have noticed that the dark Arctic night isn't as dark as it used to be. Wayne Davidson, a weather station operator, figured out that warmer air layers are reflecting light from the sun that's just below the horizon, making the night brighter. "It's getting extraordinary up here," he said. The temperature changes are causing bizarre weather patterns that no one can make sense of. The shrinking ice floes also mean more frequent encounters with hungry polar bears. In one Hudson Bay village, a mother named Lydia Anguillou had to fight off a 700-pound bear that was stalking her young son. She bravely charged at the bear, giving the hunters time to shoot it and save her child. The warming climate is also affecting the Russian Inuit in Chukotka, where they've had to drill wells because there's so little snow to melt. In Reykjavik, Iceland, February was the warmest in 41 years. In Alaska, waters that used to be sealed by ice are now open, leading to winter storms that are battering coastal villages. 24 native villages are under threat from these new conditions. In Pangnirtung, residents experienced thunder, rain, and a shocking 48-degree temperature in February, a time when it's normally bitterly cold. One resident, Donald Mearns, said, "We were just standing around in our shorts, stunned and amazed, trying to make sense of it." Elders like 87-year-old Inosik Nashalik in Pangnirtung are troubled by these changes. "We cannot pass on our traditional knowledge because it is no longer reliable," he said. "The old ways of predicting the weather by reading cloud patterns, the wind, or the stars don't work anymore because everything is different now." What the Inuit are noticing isn't just anecdotal. It's being confirmed by science. Canada's Federal Weather Service reported that this winter was the warmest since records began in 1948, with some of the largest temperature increases in the Arctic North. Douglas Bancroft, Director of Oceanography and Climate Science for Canada's Fisheries Department, explained that the warming trend is entirely consistent with predictions that global warming would hit the Arctic hardest. "We are going to see a reduction in the overall Arctic ice," he said. "Weather will get stormier because the more open water you have, the easier it is for storms to brew up. These changes will also have significant effects on the region's ecosystems, with some species adapting and others not surviving." NASA satellites have shown that ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica have been melting at an alarming rate over the past decade. Scientists predict that the ice retreat in 2006 might be one of the largest in a century. Last year's global surface temperatures tied with 1998 as the highest in over a century, signaling just how fast the planet is warming. A team of researchers published in the journal Science reported that the Bering Sea is warming so much that it's transitioning from Arctic to subarctic conditions. This warming is causing drastic changes in the environment. Gray whales are moving further north. Walruses are starving because they're stuck on ice floes in water too deep for feeding. And warmer water fish like pollock and salmon are moving in. On Nova Scotia's coast, the ice on Northumberland Strait was so thin and unstable this winter that thousands of gray seals had to give birth on unfamiliar islands. Storms and high tides washed 1,500 newborn seal pups out to sea, a tragic result of the changing climate. Jerry Conway, a marine mammal expert, said, "We are seeing dramatic changes in the weather systems." But he admitted that we don't fully understand what these changes mean for the future. While history shows that there have been warming periods before that eventually returned to normal, no one knows if that will happen this time. Back in Pangnirtung, hunter Noah Metuk fears for the future. "The world is slowly disintegrating," he said, reflecting on the changes he sees all around him. The town streets were treacherous, covered in rain that had frozen solid, with almost no snow to soften the ice. "They call it climate change," Metuk said, "but we just call it breaking up." The troubles facing the Inuit are a warning for everyone, says Sheila Watt-Cloutier, head of the International Circumpolar Conference, which represents 155,000 Inuit worldwide. She believes that people have become disconnected from their environment, but the Inuit have remained closely connected to the land and its wildlife. "They are the early warning," she said. "They see what's happening to the planet and give the message to the rest of the world." The danger of climate change. Across the globe, in the South Pacific, climate change is also wreaking havoc, confusing the natural signs that people have relied on for generations to navigate. The once predictable trade winds are now weaker and often blow in unexpected directions. Sea levels are rising at an alarming rate, threatening the very existence of entire islands. In places like Tuvalu and Vanuatu, the ocean is slowly creeping up, causing flooding, erosion, and potentially submerging these atolls altogether. Many island nations, such as the Maldives, Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu, have large portions of their populations living just a few meters above sea level, making them especially vulnerable. The potential need to relocate entire island populations due to rising seas is staggering. Robert McLeeman, in his book Climate and Human Migration, highlights that there's no real precedent for the disappearance of entire nations due to climate change. If these islands become uninhabitable, the people living there would become climate refugees, joining the millions of stateless people around the world. Yet, under current international law, there's no clear protection or automatic shelter for those displaced by rising sea levels. Although terms like environmental refugees or climate change refugees are often used, they don't have official recognition, leaving many at risk of losing not just their homes, but their national identities. As the world has modernized, especially with the advent of the industrial age, human navigation and transportation have changed dramatically. With the invention of the combustion engine, people began moving at speeds and over distances unimaginable to their ancestors. However, this progress came with a heavy cost. The massive release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere has driven climate change, creating the very problems that now threaten human mobility and navigation. But could traditional knowledge and practices from indigenous cultures offer solutions in the fight against climate change? McLeeman suggests that cultures with inherently migratory lifestyles, such as the pastoralists in Central Asia and Saharan Africa, or the Aboriginal Australians and Inuit, could provide valuable insights. For these communities, mobility and migration are deeply ingrained in their way of life, helping them adapt to changing environments and survive under challenging conditions. There's a lot that others could learn from these groups about traveling and thriving in harmony with nature. Rafis Abazov, a professor at Columbia University, argues that modern society could learn much from nomadic cultures, particularly their attitudes toward the unknown and their ability to learn from new experiences. Exploring new horizons and understanding what lies beyond the familiar are essential aspects of nomadic life. So, it's clear that indigenous communities like the Inuit have a wealth of knowledge and experience that could be invaluable to the scientific community if only their methods and traditions were given the recognition they deserve.